Hey everyone, this is Simon, and thanks for listening to another episode of the FundKernel podcast. In this episode, my guest is Rizal Wijono, Managing Director and Head of Business Development at SYNCICAP Asset Management. I was very much looking forward to this one because Rizal is an expert in ESG and sustainable investing. Now, ESG has been a very hot topic as of late, and some people might even call it controversial and divisive. But when speaking with Rizal, I can sense that he is very passionate about the topic, but more importantly, he's very knowledgeable. And I think we definitely need more knowledge and education around ESG and sustainability. So, with that said, I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. I certainly learned something from it. Here's my chat with Rizal Wijono of SYNCICAP Asset Management. My side, it looks good. So how are you, man?
Good. It's been extremely busy because I may have to go to Europe next week. It's a pleasant surprise because one of our institutional investors has decided to do an on-site visit in Brussels for due diligence, so it's actually a good sign.
Okay. You know what? That come to speak of it, that's very interesting. So first of all, thank you for being on, and thank you for your time. You have a very interesting background. You're born in Malaysia, but you grew up in Belgium.
I'm going to correct you there, Simon. I was born in Indonesia.
All right, Indonesia. Sorry. All right, Indonesia. I guess those who knows the name.
It's pretty close.
Your name would figure it out. You're born in Indonesia, but grew up in Belgium.
Yes.
Tell us that story. How did that happen?
It's well, if you get me going on this one, it can get a very long story. But long story short, I think my grandparents are, at the end of the day, ethnic Chinese. So it was one of those survival stories where they decided to escape China. They swam across the river, ended up in Indonesia, and that's where my parents were born. That's where I was born.
Right.
But as ethnic Chinese living in Indonesia in the 1970s was not ideal because Chinese actually represent a little bit about 2 to 3% of the total Indonesian population, but they generally control 70% of the entire economy.
Okay.
So what that means is wherever the Indonesians get the opportunity, the local ones, stories of discrimination are rampant, right? So that's why, my parents eventually decided, hey, look, let's try to build a better future for the family. Not that they were rich or anything like that, but they basically left Indonesia as immigrants. And for one reason or the other, we ended up in Belgium, essentially because one of my uncles was already there, so he sort of paved the way. So it's a real immigrant story. I arrived in Belgium when I was about 5 years old. And, I grew up there. The first 12 years were extremely rough because we weren't obviously Belgians. But hey, it's because of this immigrant mentality, I think it really got us to where we are right now. I think we like to think that we made it in life to some extent. My brother is an orthopedic surgeon. My sister is a dentist, right? Even though, my father was a warehouse keeper, so he basically, he's from that regard, he's been very successful. So, I grew up in Belgium, went to university there. But for the last 25 years, I've been here in Hong Kong. So trying to help asset management companies bridge Eastern and Western cultures.
Yeah. It's sort of come full circle. Are your brother and sisters still in Belgium?
Yeah, they're still there. They're still in Belgium and the Netherlands.
So you should be fluent in French.
I'm fluent in 6 languages.
Oh,
Yeah, this is something I like to brag about, even though, if you
back away, man. Back away, my friend.
but until you try to test me, right? And then the rustiness comes in. No, I no, in Belgium, you generally grew up with 2 main languages, which is Dutch if you live in the northern part of Belgium, and French, which is usually widely used in the southern part of Belgium. The eastern part of Belgium is also German speaking. So
Mm,
we grew up with all these 3 languages. English is something that comes along. Bahasa Indonesia is something that I've been given still as luggage because that's what we spoke at home. And along the way, I've learned Mandarin, Chinese Mandarin,
yeah,
with my wife who is mainland Chinese. So there you
nice.
go, 6 languages.
Oh,
I
wonderful.
hope I did the count correctly.
No, I mean, look, there's a lot of immigrant stories. I'm actually surprised because look, I was born in the 70s, late 70s.
Okay.
And obviously we also in from a Hong Kong perspective, we also experienced the first wave of people moving away from Hong Kong in the
Hmm.
80s and all that. And most of the destination that we hear about are Australia, Canada, US.
Mm.
But what I've recently uncovered is that there's actually a whole bunch of Hong Kong immigrant that went to places like Netherlands.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, there's apparently a very heavy presence, Asian Hong Kong presence in the Netherlands. My wife's friend is actually immigrated there with her family back in the 80s
Hmm.
and has been there ever since. Had a family there. They run a restaurant there, and because they were very much like you, they have an uncle who was already there in the Netherlands. So I just sort of uncovered there's a lot of Hong Kong
Mm.
Chinese or Asian emigration to the European countries as well. So not just Canada. So
Mm.
I obviously grow in Canada, but you and I share similar faith in that we come back to Asia where things are booming,
Correct.
things are happening. And I really want to get you on this podcast because I think you have some very interesting thing to talk about, especially around sustainability and investment. So, you know what? Why don't I give you some space to talk about SYNCICAP and what you guys are doing?
Okay.
But I really want to deep dive in your expertise about ESG
Sure.
because that's the main thing I wanted to really pick your brain about. But tell us about SYNCICAP. What do you guys do there?
Sure. Well, if I look back, I haven't been that long with SYNCICAP yet because at the end of the day, SYNCICAP Asset Management is a startup in Hong Kong. It was established in 2021, right? And it's established as an asset management company. And here in Hong Kong jargon, we call it Hong Kong SFC Type 1, 4, and 9 licenses, which essentially means it allows you to manage portfolios, whether it's mutual fund portfolios, institutional portfolios for institutional investors or wholesale investors. But now that is also what we do, but we do this for on behalf of European institutional investors. Now, SYNCICAP Asset Management at the end of the day is a joint venture between 2 very established asset managers. One is OFI Invest. OFI Invest is the 5th largest asset manager in France, right? In France. They're managing money on behalf of the 4th largest insurance company in France as well. So altogether, OFI Invest would manage 225 billion, give or take,
Mm,
US dollars, right? The other part of the equation, our other shareholder is a Belgian asset manager by the name of De Groof Petercam Asset Management.
okay.
Okay. The Groof Petercam Asset Management is part of one of the largest Belgian investment houses. And until recently, it was an independent one, but it was acquired by Banque Indo-Suez, part of
Mm,
the Credit Agricole Group in April this year. So now we're completely French, right? One side, Ofi Invest, French. The other side, look at the parentage, also French. De Groof Petercam Asset Management manages a little bit more than 50 billion in assets under management. So
right.
altogether, the shareholders manage 275, give or take, billion in assets under management. Now, here in Hong Kong, we manage money for our European investors. And why is that? As you can imagine, if you invest in Asia from Paris or Brussels, because that's where our headquarters are,
Mm.
and there's volatility in the markets, or there's a huge correction, or volatility in that regard, because of the time difference. By the time these guys wake up, in Paris or Brussels, the damage would have been done. It would have been very difficult to get out of the markets. So hence we decided, okay, let's try to get closer to the markets, not only from an investment perspective, but also from a client perspective.
Okay.
Because why? I should tell you, Simon, that we here in Hong Kong have the privilege of distributing our core expertise of our European shareholders, and the expertise is excellent, right? At OFI Invest, we're global leaders in things like renewable energy. Renewable energy. Renewable energy is something that is really in a sweet spot. Renewable energy is something that is we're looking. Okay, let me put it a step back. If you think about renewable energy, people usually think about wind and solar,
That's what I think. I mean,
right?
that's
Exactly.
basically what the market thinks.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's also what most people in Asia think. But already about 10 years ago, in Europe, we had this wake-up call, and we sort of realized, hey, look, there's no way you can electrify the whole world or provide the world of alternative energy only with wind and solar. So that's when we started to embark on a journey where we said, okay, how do we, if the world is moving towards a world with zero free of carbon emissions and all that by 2050, how do we get there? What kind of alternative, fuel should we be looking into?
Yeah.
Now, things like biogas factories, biomethane factories is already relatively old technology in Europe. I mean, it's a 20-year-old technology. But for Asia, it's obviously still relatively new. So we embarked on this journey where we started investing heavily into, alternative energy. And I said two of them already. Biomethane, biogas was one of them. Hydrogen is the other one. Carbon capture. We invested in companies that are at the forefront of producing e-kerosene, e-methanol. These are the kinds of alternative fuels which you will equip, ships going out to sea, replacing oil, when they have to drift on the sea for 2 to 3 months, right? This is the kind of technology that aviation would look into, to replace oil. So, so this is what we started doing, and we are one of the global leaders and pioneers in this area. That's on OFI side. On the other side, with the Belgian asset manager, they're also at the forefront of investments. It's not a very large investment house or asset manager. It's a boutique asset manager, but they're extremely good at what they do. If you look at all their flagship products, all of them are, the main strategy are over 1 billion. They have, 5 to 8 years of track record, 4 or 5-star morning stars. They tick all the boxes that you need if an institutional investor were to look for strategies. Now, but I'll give you more. The reason why I can say all this with conviction is because ever since SYNCICAP was established here in Hong Kong only 2 years ago, only 3 months after we set up shop, we got calls. We got calls coming from Japan, we got calls coming from Korea. I remember during one time of these calls asking the Japanese, how is it that you found me? Right? It's, we just set up shop here, and how is it that you're inviting me already to come to Tokyo to introduce our company and our funds? So the guy on the other side of the phone was basically telling me, Rizal, it's not that we know that you've recently set up shop here, but we've already been monitoring your funds for the last 5 years. But it's only now that we know you set up, a client servicing unit, that we think, you might be ready to sort of, try and take on, Asian clients. And, without exception, Simon, this is what we've been doing for the last 1.5 years. We've been acting on the basis of reverse inquiries based on, institutional investors and also wholesale investors that have been watching our funds, and have been calling us. So it sounds a little bit arrogant to say, but it's a great testimony of, the expertise that we have.
Yeah.
And having said that, I think one of the things that we've also been recognized for, other than, having good performance, having the longevity, having the consistency and, and robustness in our investment processes, one of the traits that we can also bring to the market is ESG. Because ESG investments is something that is, I must say, really in our DNA. Why am I saying that? At DPAM, we've been investing sustainably for the last 20 years, right? At OFI Invest for the last 25 years even. And that's actually without surprise, if I can, clarify that further, because ESG, if you really look through, through the trees, it was born in Europe. Think about the global climate change accord that was signed in Paris, right? Think about the SFDR regulation, what do you call that? The Sustainability Finance Disclosure Regulation, the thing that the framework that many fund managers are now trying to obtain. That was also born in Europe. Think about Fit for 55, right? The consensus between, I think it was 196 countries that was initially signing the Paris Climate Accord. This is seeking to reduce, fossil fuel emissions by 55% by 2030. Again, this initiative was practically born in Europe. So in Europe, we have this DNA of sustainable investments, and this is also known with my shareholders. So if I tell you, in DPAM, I think it's now 70% of our funds are SFDR 8+. Now, what that means is that, we have a very strong accountability criteria in funds.
FSDR, what does that stand for?
Okay. SFDR is actually an abbreviation for Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, SFDR.
Okay.
So this was a framework that was launched, I think it was in 2021.
Right.
And it was launched in Europe. And by default, every asset manager and every financial market player, as they call it in Europe, they had to classify their funds as SFDR Article 6, 8, or 9. Now, what does that mean? SFDR Article 6 is usually where all the funds belong. I mean, at least at the beginning, because these are the funds that basically don't look at ESG.
Okay.
Right? If you don't look at ESG, you don't have ESG standards, you don't have anything, you by default classified SFDR 6. And by default, every financial player, every financial market player, whether that's an insurance company, asset management company, pension fund, anyone managing money through a collective scheme or through some kind of a pooled vehicle, would have to have their account or their portfolio classified. Right? And you start with Article 6. That's when you basically have a fund without any ESG regard. So SFDR, again, these are disclosure requirements that you're subject to assess how sustainable you've been investing.
Okay.
Right? Then the next step up is SFDR Article 8. If you have a fund that is SFDR Article 8, that means that every company you would be investing in, you would be scoring them, right? And criteria on the basis of which you score them are criteria in regards to how environmentally friendly is this company, right? Environmentally friendly means, what's this company policy in terms of energy used, what's their waste policy, how do they conserve natural resources, how do they treat animals, so how good are you in the area of environment protection, right? The second criteria, that's the S, is social. How do you interact with your external stakeholders? how good are you in the social environment? Do you donate, right? To the community? Is there a regard with in the employees in the workplace? Um, um, you know, that's the S of ESG, and then eventually governance, right? Every company we invest in will also be scoring in terms of governance. Governance means transparency. How accountable is management, and what's the transparency? So what are the governance? What are the governance standards in your company? So every company would invest in, we would look at the ESG criteria and score them. Now,
Mm.
if you have such a framework in your investment vehicle, you would then be classified as SFDR Article 8,
Okay.
right? And eventually, the highest is SFDR Article 9. Article 9 is when you're an impact fund. Not only do you look at ESG, but you define that you want to contribute to the betterment of the world, right? So impact funds are funds like funds that help with ocean regeneration. Our renewable energy fund would classify there, because there you can effectively map out the investments that you make, the companies that you invest in.
Yeah.
These companies can have exact KPIs as to if you produce biogas factories, you can calculate by the end of 2030, if you have so many biogas factories, you would be able to replace the traditional fuels by so much, right? These are sort of the KPIs that you would have as impact funds, right?
And
So
how long has this FSDR been in place? At least
um,
it's mostly focused in Europe right now, though,
yeah,
right? Or is it?
it's Europe, and again, all the well, but actually, having said that, most of the funds are a lot of the funds do originate from Europe, right? UCITS funds. So this SFDR regulation was sprung in 2021, and it
Okay, so it's
was
relatively new,
really it's relatively new, exactly.
right?
And it was, established and launched just to make sure that if you are an investor, you would be able to assess, to what extent a particular fund is investing sustainably. Because the basic premise, obviously, of sustainable investments is that if you invest in companies that are clean, that do well for the environment, treat their people well, and is well managed. I mean, these are the companies that eventually will do well in the future, right?
Yeah.
And that's and in Europe, there's a huge drive now towards sustainable investment, which goes beyond investments with ESG.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic to have a very open discussion on, because when we ever touch on ESG, I mean, in some ways, I guess it's less so today, but if we talk even last year, it's a very controversial topic, because you have it's so I mean, the rhetoric is so divisive right now. Partly I blame, look, I don't think there is any dispute about the need to do something about things like climate change. I mean, we
Mm,
have eyes, we have skins, we know climates are changing. The dispute is whether these are man-made, whether these are who's the contributing factors.
mm,
From my perspective, who cares? It's changing, it's impacting us. I mean, George Carlin, I'm not sure if you know the guy. George Carlin has a very good joke in that, yeah, the climate is changing, everybody is scared, but guess what? The earth is going to be fine. We are going to be the one that's going away as a human species. And I think but I think partly the divisiveness was because, I guess, because the government that are implementing these ESG policies aren't really doing it in a correct way. There's a lot of heavy-handedness there's a lot of heavy-handedness in their approach. Like, for example, Canada, telling everybody, oh, we're going to go all EV by 2030. I mean, you mentioned the fact that we can't depend on wind and solar. Canada is not LA, right? We don't have sunshine 365 days a year. In fact, most of Toronto, where I grew up, we're in the dark 6 months a year. because of the long
Mm.
winters, right? So these heavy-handedness, that's partly number one. Partly number two is, I think, because nobody is actually taking a serious look about what ESG actually is. Like this standard, like FSDR, stuff like that, this is something that needs to be bring to the forefront for the public to see, okay, so that's how it works.
Mm.
And it's good that Europe is leading the charge on that. And the fact that they've done this for 20 years it means that there is an expertise, that we can, we
Mm.
can live. And from that standpoint, I see a very much array of, okay, there's hope there. There's hope that,
Mm.
okay, there are things that we can now look to, a standard that we can now look into to implement certain strategies and make certain investment decisions to help guide us toward that ESG standard. But I think more needs to be done in terms of, well, first of all, the government needs to be not so heavy-handed in their approach. And I think you guys, where where the money should go, they should actually look to you people. They should actually look to OP Invest. They should actually look to the fund managers and say, hey, how do you guys do it? How do you guys assess which ESG fund or ESG opportunity to look at? Because because by doing that,
Mm.
money speaks for itself. Money goes where the money goes, right? So from yours from so that's why I really wanted to maybe get your understanding. But how did you get into this ESG whole ESG space? I mean, were you taking a very personal interest of it before you even get into SYNCICAP?
Yes, I definitely have. I think I mentioned at the beginning that I did grow up in Belgium, and I think if you look at the former part of my career, I was also mostly with European asset management firms, right? I was with ING initially. I was there for almost about 10 years. And then I joined Deutsche for a while. And the how should I put it? The advantage that I have, having grown up in Belgium and in and in Europe was, I know how these guys think, right? But on the other hand, I'm also Chinese, right? I spent most of my life here. I'm married to a mainland Chinese lady. So when I get a Chinese guy opposite the table, and usually in two sentences, I would know what they think. At the same time, I know exactly what the European guys are thinking. Usually it's a completely different thing. It's the opposite direction.
You're like
So
the translator
it's
Miss,
let me tell you, it's not a translation of sentences. It's more a translation of feelings, emotions, and
right.
objectives. That's really what it's all about. It's
Yeah.
just to use the metaphor, right? But anyway, what I'm getting to is that Asia is catching up, right? And it's catching up so quickly. But having said that, there is still so much that Asia can learn from Europe and the US, right? From the developed world. When I joined ING, and that was in the early 2000s, we had a run of 10 years where most of the funds that we were introducing in Asia were funds that were already extremely popular in Europe, right? When we
Mhm.
introduced them here, it was the sky was the limit. Asia was just trying to digest whatever it would be able to get on its plate, right?
Yeah.
Now, we had a great run, right? We had a great run for, 15 years. And it was really the growth of Asia. Now, if you look at, I'm trying to always think, what's really ahead on the curve. And if I look at what the world is really grappling with now is, again, climate change and all that, then, again, that's an area where there is so much we could learn from Europe. Europe being at the forefront on, how you regulate things in terms of technology, and here in Asia, we're only starting, right? SFDR has not really sprung up yet, but, are people interested? Yeah, definitely yes. Are people wanting to embrace it? Yes. But there's always this misconception, Simon. People here think, if they think of ESG, they always think about sacrificing performance. And in a way, they're correct, right? Because if you are an ESG friendly fund, there are quite a number of companies you cannot invest in. Tobacco is one of them, defense-related companies, all these companies which are at the end, they're also making a lot of money. So yes, you would leave that, on the table. But there are so many other companies that would benefit from ESG. Now, the reason why SFDR was introduced was to essentially combat a term what we call greenwashing, right? People wanted to jump on the bandwagon and say, "Hey, look, I want to be ESG because if I get this endorsement, I get stamped as being ESG, people are going to be looking at me." But then the question really was, are you really having the standards that So this is what we call greenwashing, pretending to be someone that you're really not, right? And
Yeah.
to counter that phenomenon, SFDR was introduced. So if you have this regulation where you have clear standards on what you need to, to comply with, there's no way. The way how you report, the way how you need to be transparent, there's more, there's less leeway to be a little bit, jumpy about it, right?
Yeah.
So that was why it was introduced. So I think in many ways you are asking me about what do I see in these European companies. I think particularly for this thing, Europe probably is offering a blueprint of what's to come in Asia, right?
Mm.
And the learning curve that we've had in Europe, 20, 25 years of ESG investing, we'd be very happy to sort of, bring that across to Asia, act as a sparring partner for, some of the largest conglomerates here who are in the process of decarbonizing their entire investment portfolios. What should they be doing? It's not all about investing in green bonds, right? It's a lot
Yeah.
more than that. It's about the portfolios that you invest in. How do you engage with them? If there's a voting to be done, how do you design the voting policy? How do you make a difference? All those kinds of things that is so much in our DNA in Europe, and that is really only to have a start here in Asia.
But why do you think Europe is ahead of the curve from the rest of the world with this? What is this that they're seeing that the rest of the world are not seeing? It seems like they were 20 years ahead. You mentioned something like they were 20 years ahead. I mean, what do you think triggered that from the European side?
Well, it's
You say everything starts in Paris, right? So what do you think triggered that?
Well, I think growth essentially. I mean, in the last 20 years, Asia has been too busy with growing, right?
Right.
But now it's come to a stage where it needs to take a pause and say, look, are we growing sustainably? Are we doing the things that we should be doing? For the past 20 years. I mean, you look at Hong Kong itself, right? I mean, I went to this museum where they showed pictures of Hong Kong in the 1970s and 1980s.
Yeah.
It was still pretty much of an agricultural city,
Good
sort of
farming.
sort of speak, right?
Yeah.
So
Fisherman
people
town.
were too busy with developing, growing, that they potentially didn't have the space to pay attention to the other things, right? People were just too busy making sure that you also have a fridge, that you buy a car, and you have a very nice roof over your head, right? So it's natural. Now Europe, if you look at the 70s, 80s, it was already had a certain kind of maturity, and as it developed, it started paying attention to other things, right?
Yeah. So that's why Europe tends to get into that's a very interesting point as well, because a lot of people that debates around ESG is that ESG and sustainability is a luxury of the first world, right? Third world countries, if you impose ESG on them, it's just going to stifle the growth. I mean, if you look at China back in the 80s, when they start growing up, they become the factory of the world. The argument is, if you impose any ESG on them, they wouldn't have go to where they are today.
I
What do you say to that these
I
days?
respectfully disagree with that.
Yeah.
And why do I say that? Because if you look at today's day and age, many of the companies, the larger companies that do have these ESG policies, they're multinational leaders. Most of their production facilities are in the East, in Asia, right? So if you want to make an impact, sustainably, this is where it's going to be happening.
Yeah, but those are
Not in Europe.
companies, right?
Sorry?
Like what I think what they were saying is that, yeah, we invest in ESG, and it's the rich countries or countries or corporation with resources that can make those investments. But if you're asking like a third world country to live up to the same ESG standard, make the same level of investment, let's say you're talking about a country like Brazil or even some African countries that are coming up, but is not yet to the
Yeah, I
level
agree.
of the first world.
Of course.
Imposing these ESG requirement on them, you're just stifling them, right?
Agree.
That's
Agree.
the argument that was being made, right?
Well, I can't disagree with that. I mean, it's you need to have a certain maturity in terms of profit growth and all that to be. Having said that, there are companies that are adopting the ESG standards potentially without knowing it. One of the companies that I was with previously, Microconnect, what they were doing was they provide loans to very small companies so that they can set up shop. And these are loans to I don't call it microfinance, but at the end of the day, that's sort of what it is. They're providing these loans to mechanics, hairdressers, and all that. And if they've become quite a bit of a success right now. If you look at the model that they're building, so without wanting to be an ESG company, I think effectively they are one. And if they will, in my opinion, they will soon become a target of investments.
Okay.
So yes, you're right. If you're still worried about putting bread on the table, there's no way you're going to be thinking about what fashion clothes am I going to be wearing, right?
So based on that, though, I mean, look, Asia is so fragmented with so many countries, so many different cultures, each with different level of development. When you say Asia is catching up, quickly catching up, I mean, are you referring to specific Asian market, like maybe possibly like a Japan and Korea and China? I mean,
Asia is like a melt pot, right? I mean, if the disparity in wealth distribution can be extremely vast. And yes, obviously, if you look at countries like Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, they're already at the brink of same, ESG or sustainable investment standards as the West is, or at least they're aiming to be, right? Then you've got all the countries down there in between, right? China is obviously one of them. It's progressing very quickly. It's catching up. But I think until very recently, attention or the regulator drive for ESG has not really been there. And you're right. I mean, if you look at countries like below that, more of the frontier countries, that's where the attention span for ESG is going to be even tighter, right? Shorter. So yeah, there is definitely this degradation of countries.
But do you feel your conversation with investors sort of changes? You've been SYNCICAP for 2 years. Do you feel in these 2 years, the conversation and the narrative you use to talk about ESG and why they need to invest in ESG funds that has an ESG impact score, do you find the narrative change?
Of course. I mean, look at it from their perspective, Simon. Look, if you're a company, right, you don't adopt these ESG standards, it's going to be very hard for you to get the attention of, a large fund for them to be investing in you. And if you look at companies, obviously you have, the large growth companies that are, I'm not talking about them, but even companies that are thinking of an IPO, right? Or pre-IPO level. Well, whether they want or not, they will have to think about this because, the whole world is moving towards that framework. So if they don't adjust, it's going to be very hard for them to attract the funding that they need to have a successful IPO, right?
But is that urgency not there 2 years ago, and you're now sensing that urgency now?
It's obviously more profound today, and I'll give an example. When I went to China last year, we went on an institutional tour. I was there with my global CEO. We met a lot of institutional investors, not only about ESG, just generally to introduce our company and all that, but ESG, very little attention, very
Mm.
little. I mean, there was no people just weren't really interested, right? Now, we went back about 3 months ago in April, no, not in April, in May, right? And the scenery has completely changed because, and I'll tell you the reason why. I think ESG has, there's been some kind of a wake-up call because I think what's happened was that um, these days there is a lot of drive for Fit for 55. There's a lot of news on on the Paris Accord, on wanting to keep the world steady with 1.5%. A lot of forum, whatever you call it, Davos and all that. Right? Everyone is. If there's one thing people were talking about, it is this global climate, right?
Right.
So I think what happened was, the central government, they had some sort of a wake-up call, and they said, hey, look, if the whole world is moving towards zero carbon-free emissions by 2050, and everyone is already in the process of setting up procedures, framework, they looked around, they saw that nobody is really working on it. So they issued all these directives for people to start implementing their ESG frameworks. And so when we went to China 3 months ago, it was a complete different atmosphere, right? All of a sudden, we were the darling because we've invested in ESG for the last 20 years. So people want to know, how do you do it? What kind of people do you recruit? How do you do the engagement policy? What are the criteria that you use for the E, for the S, for the G? How do you put together the scorecard? All these kinds of things. We had all these questions, right? So it's and ever since we've had inquiries from practically everywhere in Asia, whether it's Hong Kong, Japan, people who are thinking, of decarbonizing their entire investment portfolio. What criteria should we be setting ourselves? All these things. So it's been very active for us in this regard.
I think what you guys do there, you guys have a very interesting perspective, because look, I've seen a lot of different podcasts, different opinions about ESG and all that. One of the bigger opponent of ESG, they make this argument beside the other ones. They make this argument is that, look, we can't measure out the impact of whatever we do now, whatever policy change that we claim to be positive to the environment or whatever social impact that we have, we won't be able to see its effectiveness 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. And therefore, how do you know whatever policy we're implementing now will not actually make things worse? Therefore, we shouldn't be doing anything, right?
Yeah.
But from your perspective, because you guys have been doing it for 20 years, you guys can actually says, no, we've been doing this for 20 years. We can see, here are the results, right? You can testify to that.
We have the crystal ball, Simon.
Yeah, so you can testify to that.
Yeah.
You actually have a documented evidence that we have done this investment 20 years ago.
Agree.
20 years now, today, this is the impact that we've had. So you can't really dispute that this is not, working, right? The downside, obviously, is that, well, you got to wait 20 years. But then again, I think there was I'm very bad at remembering things to say, but I think there was a saying that we're investing in a tree that we will never be able to reap the fruit of. But our children and grandchildren will be able to have the fruit.
That is correct.
Right? So I think I'm pretty much sure I botched that.
That's completely correct. And I think you've summed up the arguments and summarized them very eloquently.
Well, you guys have that pedigree, because I think a lot of ESG companies doesn't have that. A lot of ESG companies says, oh, we've been around, especially now, like we're in a startup space. Cyberport in Hong Kong, they have a lot of green startup, a lot of startup that, does carbon measurement and all that type of thing. And to be frank, like I wish them all the success in the world, but at the same time, you've only been around for like 2 years, 3 years, right?
Well,
And
here in Asia, yes, but
yeah, here,
been.
well, I mean, yeah, the company in itself
Mm,
is 2, 3 years.
mm,
Realistically, when we're talking about climate, we're talking about social impact, we're talking
mm.
about such a macro level. Changes doesn't happen overnight. Change
Correct.
doesn't happen over a year. Change happens over decades, right? And it's refreshing to have a firm that can say, no, we've been doing this for decades.
Mm,
We have that data to see that it is creating some positive, well, it definitely creating some positive return. And obviously you can make money out of it too, right?
mm,
Returns out of it too. And that's unique.
mm,
At least from an ESG, from my, my idiot understanding of the ESG standpoint,
mm.
that's unique.
And to further illustrate this, I can take it even further. We are actually already beyond ESG. I mean, if there's a difference between ESG and sustainable investments, right?
What's the difference?
Sustainable investments, ESG is about, the decision making, whereas impact investments is what kind of impact would you like as a result of the decisions that you've made? And I'll give you an example. Renewable energy, for instance, right? Renewable energy is what we call an impact fund. Impact fund is the highest level of what I earlier mentioned, SFDR. It's an SFDR Article 9 fund, right?
Yeah.
What it effectively means is we can very clearly articulate performance, targets, right? Impact targets. And we have a lot of the funds are actually impact funds, the funds that we manage. What kind of impact would we like to make on the world? So renewable energy is one of them. We have another fund which we call Blue Ocean. Blue Ocean is about ocean regeneration, right?
That's
How sexy is that, right?
ocean is, I mean, even the most skeptical climate change skeptics, they can't deny the ocean is dying.
Exactly. So, how good is that to be able to, contribute to making this a better world by trying to regenerate the ocean, because in many ways the ocean is actually at the core of everything we do, right? Whether it's global climate, reducing, the fish that 1/3 of the population lives off the sea. But at the same time, yes, you're right, the ocean is dying, right? Look at the pollution, look at the, overfishing, look at everything that's happening. So with our Blue Ocean Fund, we're trying to have an impact fund that can regenerate the ocean. We have things like, so these are two examples of them. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, ESG is really at the core of everything we do. It's in our DNA, right? It's just how far you are able to take it, right? And launch impact funds of it.
But that's where things separate between you and other funds. Because let's say an equity long short, right? I mean, let's say an equity long short. I mean, at the end of the day, the objective of these funds is to gain absolute returns. I mean, that's the end of it all. I mean, you call it a hedge fund, you call it whatever. Okay, we're looking for absolute return. And we're dealing with fund like yours. I think it's almost wrong to approach it in that lens because it's so strategic, right? You're actually investing in not only the returns, but you're actually making your footprint as an impact of the overall environment in the future. It's a very strategic play because it does take a while for these type of investment to yield results, but when it does, it could be massive. It's like building a brick. It's like I'm building a bridge between Hong Kong to Macau back in the 1980s, back in the 1800s, right? Nobody would have thought that would be useful, but you're strategically built something today so that once Hong Kong and Macau grow to a certain point, that bridge will become a critical channel between these two places. It's almost as if these type of investment, you need to have a very foresight. You almost got to be some sort of visionary to sort of make that decision. But I think the good part is, again, going back to your 20-year pedigree, is that, well, we've seen this vision realized, right? We've seen this vision realized through our investment, and we can demonstrate that. It's not like you're betting on a dream that you haven't seen. Yeah, it's been realized in some sense. We're just,
I think what I can say is that, we found the right people at the right time to be designing a strategy like this. But the one caveat that I'd like to make is that obviously you can't generalize investments, in one melt pot, right? Because this is not for everyone. I mean, these are private equity investments. They do have a very long maturity duration, right?
yeah,
There's no liquidity, right? So it all depends on what it is that you're looking for in terms of investment objectives, right? I mean, you mentioned hedge funds. Hedge funds are obviously there to, fill a certain different investment objectives. So yes, you're right. Through private equity, and we can embody strategic investment themes like renewable energy, and launch true impact funds. But as I said, this is obviously not for everyone. This is a fund that we're only targeting institutional, or should I call it in Hong Kong terms, professional investors with.
so who are calling you right now? You said that there were this Japanese fund that has been looking at you guys for 5 years.
Okay.
What
No, that's so I'm wearing different hats, right? One side, we've been talking about the private equity funds. That's really what we invest. But on the other side, we also have our liquid investment strategies. These are mutual funds investing in global equity, large cap, global fixed income funds.
okay,
The
they're more,
normal plain vanilla liquid, day in, day out kind of strategy. These are the funds that are currently managed by the Grove Petercam Asset Management, one of our two shareholders, and they've had a very strong performance. Many of these flagship products, and these are the ones that have garnered a lot of interest with with institutional investors, particularly when they use the help of databases.
yeah, yeah. So where do you think investors are still very much back in, like, so you talked about 2 years ago, nobody really cared, and now 2 years back now, you're darling of the event. That's in China. Do you feel there are other countries in Asia that is still a little bit behind and that needs to do a little bit catch up on you guys, or where do you think that is?
I've been in Asia for the last 30 years, and I think the one thing that many countries in Asia are very good at is to look over the shoulder as to what Big Brother is doing, right? And eventually, if you look at China, right, about 20 years ago, they practically, their regulatory framework, the regulatory framework of the CSRC was actually still in child's shoes, right? But if you look at what it is right now, it's very sophisticated. So they've really made a long way. The learning curve was definitely very steep. So many of them have gone through this steep learning curve. And yes, are there differences between these countries? Obviously, yes. But I think if you just look at Hong Kong, right, there are 7 recognized jurisdictions here, right? And if you look at but they're in Hong Kong, they're also positioning the Hong Kong domicile as a more and more now. And if you look at the regulation, it's pretty similar to what the other more sophisticated jurisdictions are. So everything is in my opinion really coming together.
So in terms of like innovation, like you guys, the PE fund that invest in these companies, do you see a shift of innovations that maybe previously a lot more innovation in the green field comes out of Europe? Do you sort of see a shift that, okay, there are some capital leaning toward Asia now because there's a lot more innovative company coming out that focuses on there's focus on sustainability, focus on impact? Do you see that shift within your funds that, okay, yeah, we're not going to move here, Asia, with a little startup and stuff like that does these type of thing?
I
Or is
think
it Europe? I mean, is it still Europe?
no, I think Asia in general embraces innovation, right? You look at what the Hong Kong government is doing in terms of attracting new companies. It's extremely respectable. Innovation, I think, let me put it this way. A lot of the activities actually focused around where growth is centered, right? So growth in general is still by default mostly here in Asia. If you look at, you know, US, Europe, I mean, they're hovering around, maybe 1.5% growth GDP, whereas here, populations are still relatively young. You look at the country like Indonesia, right? China still claims that they have 4 or 5%, GDP growth. So where there's growth, there will be innovation. That's basically what it is, right? And now, where does Europe fit in? Europe has actually a lot of very interesting technologies, right? But the technologies, I think many of them have been segregated to the extent that, for a lot of Europeans, it was okay for them to stay in their home country, right? Why? Because, because they were doing very relatively well, everybody gets food on the table and, they didn't really have to be ambitious. But as Europe is also stagnant in terms of growth, they are now having to look beyond Europe as to and to look as to where growth is. And there are obviously examples where companies, once they started internationalizing, all of a sudden they were looking at a market, China. In 5 to 10 years, it was a market 10 times their home domestic market. So you can imagine, right? And that will trigger innovation in itself again, right? So companies that say, hey, I've got a very interesting technology, and they see their competitor or their peers, expanding abroad, acquiring market share, obviously this will aggravate. And that's where innovation comes in. Innovation doesn't mean that you do something, that you have something disruptive, right? Innovation can just be not disruptive, but challenging the status quo, right? By bringing something new to the table. So that's basically where I think a lot of the companies and the European companies have to offer when they decide to come to Asia.
I think what a lot of people misconstrued is the fact that Chinese has, I mean, yes, statistically they are still polluting massively, but let's not forget they have 13 billion. Is it 13 or 1.3 billion? My numbers things are not good. They have the most population in the world. I mean,
even 1.4 now.
Yeah, so I think you really got to, even though it's coming down, but it's still a lot of people you got to sustain, right? They're not getting away from coal, but what a lot of people don't know is that these coal power plants, you can actually be very efficient with coal. There are some coal power plants that are being built now that is tremendously efficient in terms of minimizing the carbon footprint and all that. And I think a lot of Chinese companies are deploying those. But that's where I wanted to see what the other innovation is, because I remember when I was in your office the other day, seeing you present. I think there's a Hong Kong company that was invested. They now moved to Singapore, but and I do see a lot of innovations from Science Park and Cyberport that really focus on these type of thing. And it'd be good if company like an OFI that has these PE fund would look here. I mean, do they invest more? I mean, do they invest globally? How do they find the underlying company to invest in?
Well, I think many sectors run such that it's usually a small circle, right? And when you are in a certain sector, particularly you're in a niche sector, you have a rather unique technology. It won't take a long time before people take notice, right? That's what we always see. And ocean regeneration seems like a very large concept, but at the end of the day, if you look for companies that are truly in ocean regeneration, there are not that many that are very successful, right? Yet. But we're very optimistic that this is an asset class which will be successful. We
Is
have
it because the technology is still not there yet? I mean, is it hindered by, or the commercialization of the business is
no, no,
still
no. I think it depends on the investment strategy because we tend to invest in companies that are more scalable, and to the extent we're trying to find companies that combat, let's say, pollution. We're trying to find companies that encourage, aquaculture.
Mm,
We're combating companies that combat overfishing. So as I said, we in that regard, we have the fortunate we're fortunate to be working with IFREMER, which is a global oceanology institute. They're very well represented all across the world, and I think it's about 87 countries.
yeah.
Every project that we basically would look into, we would run through them, right? They run a non-profit kind of an organization, and so that's what I'm saying. It seems like a wide concept, but in terms of application, it's still got a lot of room to grow.
So any chance that FSDR will become, I mean, right now it's Europe centric, obviously. Do you foresee it being a globally adopted standard in terms of measurement, or are there competing standards?
Yeah, I can't say I can't speak for the agencies that lobby for this, but what I do see is even we have investors coming up to us and say, and these are Asian investors, you know, how you classified in SFDR? What are you? Are you Article 6 or you Article 8? So people do know it, right? People do understand it.
So it's not like an unknown thing. It's people
No,
do.
it's not an unknown thing. And even if you say, hey, look, we are an Article 8 plus SFDR, people get it, right? And it's not that it's uncommon. And these are Asian investors in Korea, investors in Japan,
Yeah.
less so in China, but people are beginning to understand.
But do you find them to be already sort of educated in this sense when you talk to them the first time? Or do you feel like there's still a little bit of education that needs to be given before they sort of understand where you're coming from?
Look, I think even in Europe, there's a lot of education to be done, right? In terms of, but I think what's important here in Asia is people are open to it. People are keen to learn, right?
Mm,
And that's important. That's always the beginning of regulation taking shape.
yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I certainly learned a lot. I mean, from my standpoint, I'm not even an institutional investor. I'm not even in the capital allocation, or I don't even know how to select fund. All I get from ESG is what I see in the news, right? And I think they're doing a terrible job in promoting ESG. They're doing a terrible job in helping the masses understanding ESG. But I do feel in my heart that it's an important thing that we should look at. The question
I
is,
agree.
how should we look at it, right?
Mm.
So for FundKernel, I'm almost ashamed to say that, we do want to implement ESG, but we simply don't know how because we don't have the expertise. Right now, we can either make some adjustment to the curation engine to factor in ESG score on an each individual fund level, or do we simply just adopt the FSDR and use that as a filter, right? It's almost easier for us right now to adopt the
Mm.
FSDR because obviously it's developed by experts, and you need an auditor to get that score, correct? How does one obtain these ranking, these six?
There's an audit to be done, and there are, for every article, there are a set of criteria to be complied with, so
Right.
it's not an easy process, I agree.
Not an easy process. So that's something that it might be easier for us as a, as a platform.
Let me rectify it. It's actually a relatively easy process to comply with for the first time, but to maintain it, that's a different one.
Yeah, I think the maintenance part of it will sort of make things will be challenging. But from my standpoint is how do we want to incorporate that into our platform so investor or capital allocator that uses us can also factor that in, right? How much information can we add to our platform, to our fund to sort of reflect that? I think I need a lot of education in that, and I'm glad there are people like you who exactly know what they're doing. I'm glad that Europe has these type of framework that we can reference on. We may not adopt it, but at least there is some sort of a benchmark framework that we can reference, right? Is there something similar in Asia right now that's being developed, or you don't know? There's nothing happening right now.
We have many discussions with the chairman of SIF. SIF is the sustainability agency in China. And the last time we spoke, he's obviously also trying to increase awareness, organizing conferences, seminars, and all that. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think there is such a concentrated effort in, putting together one framework where they establish standards for transparency, reporting, all those kinds of things. I think if something were to be set up, it would probably be modeled after a framework that already exists and that they know is already working.
I mean, it's still 2 years. I mean, I'm sure the framework will have a lot of adjustments. At least it's a starting point. Right?
Correct.
And that's what a lot of the challenges I see with ESG is that nobody know where to start. Nobody know how do I measure and all that. But if there's a framework to be made now, not to say that the framework is perfect. It's not. Nothing is perfect. But at least it's a start. And adjustments should be made, right? And if Asia or if any countries or any government like a Hong Kong look to adopt these type of framework for their own corporate, for Hong Kong exchange companies, and at least there's something to reference, right? And then make their adjustment. Are you guys working with any government entities right now in terms of like, because I know a lot of government are looking to make their investment, like these sovereign funds are making investment into these types
Yes. We have discussions ongoing with many of the governments.
Okay. So what's your experience like talking with them in terms of...
Look, they're very open, extremely gung-ho on, look, what is it we should be doing? How should we? It's nothing other than positive things to talk about.
One thing that I always joke about is the reason I deal with family offices now is because I've been in a fintech space for 15 years. It's been a nightmare trying to sell anything to private banks. The bureaucracy, all that is very hard. But once it gets to like a family office, even a multi-family office with 10, 20 people, I mean, they make decisions very quickly. I mean, they have a very simple mindset. I could only imagine dealing with a sovereign fund, wealth fund, or government pension fund, what type of due diligence that you have to go through in order. I mean, even you have a great thesis, great track record, great everything. I mean, it's still, I could just imagine it could still be just a nightmare to deal with these.
The question to ask, Simon, is who is trying to do what for who, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But I think you guys have a great offering. And I think, look, I mean, Rizal, thank you very much for your time. I learned a lot.
My pleasure.
Yeah, hopefully you liked it. You liked the chat. I would love to have you back again because
sure, my pleasure.
So much more that we can talk about, and give people how do they find you?
They can Google us and SYNCICAP Asset Management. All my contact details are there, or there's an email there. I will be very happy to speak to anyone regarding this topic. And,
Okay. Active on LinkedIn, you're active
on LinkedIn, just Google my name and people can find me there as well.
Okay, awesome. So Rizal, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
And it's been great chatting.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Thanks for the opportunity,
we'll
Simon.
come up for drinks. We'll come up for drinks.
Sure.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks, Rizal.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.